The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the ballroom as laughter rippled through the air like waves of pure joy. My ivory gown caught the light as I moved through the reception, accepting congratulations from guests who had traveled from across the country to witness what should have been the most beautiful day of my life. The scent of gardenias filled the air, and somewhere in the distance, a string quartet played the melody that had brought tears to my eyes during our first dance. I was Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, fresh from my third deployment in Afghanistan, and I had never felt more radiant or more hopeful about the future that stretched ahead of me and my new husband David. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Everything had been perfect until that moment. The moment when my father-in-law, Richard Hartwell, decided to remind everyone exactly what he thought of his son marrying a soldier. The moment when he raised his champagne glass high above the crowd, his face flushed with alcohol and something far more poisonous, and declared in a voice that cut through the music like a blade through silk, "Here's to my son David, who could have married anyone with class and breeding but instead chose to settle for damaged goods from the trailer park." The glass slipped from his trembling fingers as the words left his mouth, crystal shattering against the marble floor like the illusion of family acceptance I had foolishly allowed myself to believe in. The ballroom fell silent. 200 guests turned their eyes toward me, some with pity, others with shock, and a few with the kind of morbid curiosity that feeds on public humiliation. My mother-in-law, Patricia, gasped and covered her mouth with her diamond-laden fingers. But she didn't correct him. She never did. My new sister-in-law, Jessica, smirked behind her wine glass, finally seeing the entertainment she had been hoping for all evening. And David, my husband of 3 hours, stood frozen beside the wedding cake, his face pale as the fondant roses that decorated our three-tiered symbol of unity. But I wasn't the same girl who had grown up in Pine Ridge, Georgia anymore. I wasn't the scholarship kid who had learned to shrink herself small enough to fit into spaces where she wasn't wanted. 4 years in the Army had taught me something that Richard Hartwell and his country club cronies would never understand. I had learned that respect isn't given based on your father's bank account or your mother's maiden name. It's earned through courage, through sacrifice, through standing up when others choose to kneel. And in that moment, surrounded by the scattered remains of his champagne glass and the weight of his contempt, I felt something ignite in my chest that had been building since the day I first met this family. The story of how we reached this moment didn't begin at an altar, or even when David first brought me home to meet his parents. It started much earlier, in a place where the American dream felt more like a cruel joke, and where a girl learned that sometimes the only way to prove your worth is to leave everything you know behind and forge it in fire. This was the breaking point. But to understand why it mattered so much, you need to know where I came from and how I became the woman standing in that ballroom, refusing to let anyone make me feel small ever again. I was born Sarah Elizabeth Cooper, in a single-wide trailer on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, Georgia, where the railroad tracks divided the town between those who belonged and those who were just passing through. My mother, Linda, worked double shifts at the textile factory to keep food on our table and clothes on my back, while my father had disappeared before my second birthday, leaving behind nothing but empty beer bottles and a stack of unpaid bills that would follow us for years. The trailer park where we lived wasn't the kind of place that appeared in travel brochures or real estate advertisements. It was a collection of weathered aluminum boxes connected by gravel roads and held together by the stubborn determination of people who refused to give up, even when life seemed determined to break them down. Our neighbors were a mixed collection of single mothers, retired veterans living on disability checks, and families who worked 2 or 3 jobs just to afford the monthly lot rent. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, who babysat me after school while my mother worked late, teaching me Spanish curse words that made her laugh until she cried. There was Tommy's family next door, where his father came home every night covered in motor oil, and his mother grew the most beautiful tomatoes I had ever seen in coffee cans lined up along their front steps. And there was old Mr. Franklin, who had fought in Vietnam and still woke up screaming some nights, but who taught me how to change a tire and throw a proper punch when the kids at school started calling me trailer trash. The elementary school I attended was a 15-minute bus ride into town, where the real Pine Ridge began. The Pine Ridge with manicured lawns and white picket fences, where mothers drove SUVs instead of taking the bus, and where children carried lunchboxes instead of brown paper bags. I learned early to keep my head down and my mouth shut, to finish my homework by the light of a desk lamp in our tiny kitchen, while my mother counted tips from her second job waitressing at the all-night diner. I learned that being smart wasn't enough if you didn't have the right clothes or the right address, and that some teachers looked at you differently when they saw Shady Oaks Mobile Home Park written on your emergency contact forms. But I also learned something else during those years. I learned that hunger makes you fierce, and that when you have nothing to lose, you have everything to gain. While my classmates worried about which brand of sneakers to wear or whether they would make the cheerleading squad, I worried about whether the electricity would get turned off again, or if my mother would have enough money for both rent and groceries. Those worries carved something deep inside me, a determination that burned like a coal in my chest. I would not end up like the women I saw around me, working themselves to death for minimum wage and a pat on the head. I would find a way out, and I would take my mother with me. High school brought new challenges and new humiliations. Pine Ridge High was where the town's social hierarchy became impossible to ignore, where the children of doctors and lawyers and business owners formed their exclusive circles, and where scholarship kids like me learned to navigate the cafeteria like a minefield. I threw myself into my studies with a desperation that my guidance counselor mistook for academic passion, maintaining a perfect grade point average while working weekends at the local grocery store to help my mother pay bills. I joined every club that would have me, not because I was particularly interested in debate team or student government, but because I knew that college applications required extracurricular activities, and college was my ticket out of Pine Ridge. The military recruiter showed up during my junior year, setting up a table in the school cafeteria during lunch period. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was everything I had never seen in a woman before. She stood straight and tall in her dress blues, her hair pulled back in a perfect bun, her medals catching the fluorescent lights. When she spoke about leadership and service, about earning respect and building a career that meant something, I felt something shift inside my chest. This wasn't just about escaping Pine Ridge anymore. This was about becoming someone who mattered. Someone who commanded respect, not because of where she came from, but because of what she had accomplished. My mother cried when I told her about my decision to enlist. We sat in our tiny living room, surrounded by the mismatched furniture we had collected from garage sales and thrift stores over the years, and she held my hands while tears.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Streamed down her cheeks. She had worked so hard to give me opportunities she never had, sacrificing everything so I could have a chance at something better. The idea of me going into combat, of facing dangers she couldn't protect me from, terrified her in ways that our poverty never had. But when I explained what the Army could offer me, the education benefits and the career training, and the chance to serve something bigger than myself, she nodded slowly and squeezed my hands tighter. The night before I left for basic training, we sat on the front steps of our trailer, watching the sun set over the railroad tracks that had defined the boundaries of my world for 18 years. My mother had packed my few belongings into an old duffel bag that had belonged to Mr. Franklin, and we both knew that when I came back, everything would be different. I wouldn't be the same girl who had grown up ashamed of her address and her secondhand clothes. I would be a soldier, and soldiers didn't apologize for where they came from. They proved where they were going. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was everything the recruiters had promised, and nothing I could have prepared for. The Missouri heat was oppressive, turning our uniforms into furnaces and our barracks into ovens. The drill sergeants seemed to take particular pleasure in breaking down recruits who thought they knew what hard work meant, and I discovered that all those years of struggle in Pine Ridge had only been preparation for the real test. My bunkmate was a girl named Ashley from Connecticut, whose father was a hedge fund manager and whose idea of hardship was having to share a bathroom with her sister. She lasted 2 weeks before washing out, crying into her cell phone about how she missed her horse and her tennis lessons. But I thrived in ways that surprised even me. The physical training that left other recruits gasping and complaining felt like meditation after years of working multiple jobs and carrying the weight of my family's survival on my shoulders. The discipline and structure that some found suffocating felt like freedom to me. For the first time in my life, success was measured by effort and results, not by your father's occupation or your mother's social connections. When I graduated at the top of my class, earning recognition as the outstanding trainee in my company, I felt a pride that reached deeper than any grade one had ever received in school. The Army became more than just my escape from Pine Ridge. It became my identity, my family, my purpose. I specialized in communications and intelligence, earning my lieutenant's bars through a combination of natural aptitude and relentless determination. My first deployment took me to Iraq, where I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. My second deployment brought me to Afghanistan, where I led a team responsible for coordinating communication between forward operating bases and helped save lives by ensuring that critical information reached the right people at the right time. Between deployments, I sent money home to my mother, helping her move out of the trailer park and into a small apartment in town. I enrolled in online courses, working toward my degree during my off-duty hours. And slowly, I began to believe that maybe I had finally put enough distance between myself and that girl from Shady Oaks Mobile Home Park. Maybe I had finally become someone who deserved respect, someone who had earned her place at any table. That confidence was what led me to believe I could handle meeting David's family. I met David Hartwell at a military appreciation event in Atlanta during my leave between my second and third deployments. He was there representing his law firm, which had sponsored the event, looking uncomfortable in his perfectly tailored suit, as he tried to make small talk with veterans who had little patience for corporate networking. I was there in my dress uniform, feeling proud and confident, representing everything I had worked so hard to become. When he approached me at the FITA refreshment table, stumbling over his words as he tried to thank me for my service, I was charmed by his genuine awkwardness and the way he seemed more interested in hearing about my experiences than in talking about himself. David was everything I had never allowed myself to want. He was educated and cultured, with a law degree from Emory University and a family history that traced back to the founding of Georgia. He spoke fluent French and had traveled to Europe multiple times, casually mentioning art museums and wine tastings with the same ease that I might discuss military protocols or weapon specifications. But more importantly, he seemed to see something in me that I was still learning to see in myself. He was fascinated by my stories from deployment, impressed by my leadership experience, and completely unbothered by the fact that I could disassemble and reassemble an M4 rifle faster than he could tie his shoes. Our courtship unfolded through video calls and handwritten letters during my final deployment. He would send me care packages filled with books and coffee and photographs of Atlanta, while I shared stories from Afghanistan that helped him understand a world far removed from corporate law and country club dinners. When I returned stateside for good, he was waiting at the airport with flowers and a smile that made me believe in fairy tales again. For 6 months, we existed in a bubble of new love and shared dreams, making plans for a future that seemed bright and boundless. The first time he mentioned bringing me home to meet his parents, I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in my stomach. David had mentioned his family in passing, describing his father as a successful businessman and his mother as a prominent figure in Atlanta society. His sister Jessica worked in public relations for a major corporation, and his younger brother Michael was finishing his MBA at Wharton. They lived in Buckhead, in a house that David described as a full-time gardening staff. It was a world as foreign to me as Afghanistan had been, but I told myself that my military service had prepared me for any challenge. David tried to prepare me for what to expect, explaining his family's traditions and social expectations with the careful diplomacy of someone who loved both his fiancée and his family, even when those loves seemed incompatible. His father had built his wealth through real estate development and had strong opinions about social class and appropriate behavior. His mother had been raised in old Atlanta society and placed great importance on family lineage and social connections. They were, David assured me, good people who would come to appreciate my strength and character once they got to know me. The Hartwell family estate sat on 3 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in the heart of Buckhead, surrounded by wrought iron gates and security cameras that tracked our progress up the circular driveway. The house itself was a monument to Southern grandeur, with white columns and expansive porches that spoke of a Georgia that existed more in imagination than in reality. As we pulled up to the front entrance, I caught sight of Patricia Hartwell watching from an upstairs window, her silhouette framed by heavy curtains that probably cost more than my mother's monthly rent. Richard Hartwell met us at the front door, his handshake firm but brief, his eyes taking in my appearance with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating livestock. He was shorter than I had expected, but carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his polo shirt and khakis pressed to military precision, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. Behind him, Patricia descended the grand staircase like a queen granting an audience, her blonde hair swept into an elaborate updo and her jewelry sparkling in the foyer's chandelier light. The dinner that followed was a masterclass in subtle warfare. Patricia asked pointed questions about my family background, each inquiry designed to expose the gaps in my pedigree while maintaining the veneer of polite interest. Where had I attended preparatory school? Had my family been members of any particular club? What church had we attended growing up? Each honest answer seemed to lower their opinion of me further, their smiles becoming more strained and their eye contact more fleeting. Richard contributed his own observations about the declining standards of military service and the unfortunate tendency of modern young people to confuse individual achievement with actual breeding. Jessica joined us for dessert, arriving fashionably late in a designer dress that probably cost more than my car. She was everything I had expected David's sister to be: beautiful, polished, and ruthlessly passive-aggressive. She asked about my deployment experiences with the wide-eyed fascination of someone visiting a zoo, treating my service like an amusing novelty rather than a professional accomplishment. When I mentioned the team I had led and the responsibilities I had carried, she nodded with the same expression she might use to acknowledge a pet's trick. "How brave," she murmured, stirring sugar into her coffee with a silver spoon that caught the light like a weapon. The evening concluded with Richard offering to show me his study, a wood-paneled shrine to his various business achievements and social connections. The walls were covered with photographs of him shaking hands with politicians and celebrities, awards from civic organizations, and diplomas from prestigious universities. He poured himself a scotch from a crystal decanter and gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs that faced his massive oak desk. The conversation that followed was brief and devastating in its clarity. David was his heir apparent, Richard explained, destined to take over the family business and carry on their name and reputation. The woman he married would become the face of their family in Atlanta society, representing their values and their standing in the community. I was, he said, with the casual cruelty of absolute certainty, simply not equipped for that role. My background, my appearance, my obvious lack of sophistication would be a constant source of embarrassment. Surely I could understand that someone of my intelligence would want what was best for David, even if that meant stepping aside for someone more appropriate. I sat in that leather chair, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and privilege, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't about David's happiness or our compatibility or the love we shared. This was about maintaining a social order that placed people like me permanently outside the gates, regardless of what we had accomplished or sacrificed. Richard Hartwell saw me as a threat to his family's carefully constructed image, a reminder that success could be earned rather than inherited. And he had decided that I needed to be eliminated before I could contaminate their pristine bloodline. I left that house with my head held high and my engagement ring still sparkling on my finger, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. The girl from Pine Ridge who had always felt like she needed to prove herself worthy had been replaced by a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. If the Hartwell family wanted a war, they would get one. But they had made the mistake of challenging someone who had been trained for battle, someone who had learned that the only way to defeat an enemy was to know them better than they knew themselves. David was mortified when I told him about his father's offer, but he was also conflicted in ways that cut deeper than Richard's insults ever could. He loved me, he insisted, and he would marry me regardless of his family's approval. But he also couldn't bring himself to completely sever ties with parents who had shaped his entire world, who controlled the trust fund that would secure our future, who held the keys to the social connections that had defined his identity since birth. He wanted me to be patient, to give them time to come around, to prove myself worthy of their acceptance through some combination of charm and persistence that would magically transform their prejudices into appreciation. But I had spent too many years trying to prove myself to people who had already decided I didn't belong. I had endured too many nights hungry and afraid to waste energy on winning over people who saw my struggles as evidence of my inferiority rather than proof of my strength. The Hartwell family could accept me as I was, or they could watch their son marry me anyway. Those were their options, and I was done pretending there were others. The engagement party 3 months later became the first real battle in what would become an ongoing war. Patricia had insisted on hosting it at their country club, surrounding us with the cream of Atlanta society and the kind of people who judged others based on their address and their ancestors. I wore my dress uniform, the blue fabric crisp and the ribbons on my chest, telling the story of my service in a language that these people couldn't ignore or diminish. When the club president introduced me to his wife as David's little soldier girl, I corrected him with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Lieutenant Cooper, actually. I led a team of 30 soldiers in Afghanistan. The reactions ranged from awkward silence to thinly veiled hostility, but I held my ground with the same determination that had carried me through firefights and sandstorms. When Richard's business partner made a joke about women in combat, I responded with statistics about female service members and casualty rates that left him speechless. When one of Patricia's garden club friends suggested that military service was admirable, but hardly equivalent to a proper education, I mentioned my master's degree in international relations and my plans to attend law school using my GI Bill benefits. By the end of the evening, I had won some grudging respect and made some powerful enemies, but most importantly, I had established that I would not be intimidated or dismissed. The Hartwell family might have home field advantage, but I had something they didn't: the absolute certainty that I belonged wherever I chose to stand. David watched it all with a mixture of pride and anxiety, torn between admiration for my strength and fear of the consequences it might bring. The months leading up to our wedding were filled with increasingly hostile engagements, each family gathering becoming another opportunity for Richard and Patricia to demonstrate their disapproval while maintaining the facade of family unity. They questioned every decision David and I made, from the venue to the guest list to the menu, treating our preferences as evidence of our poor judgment and unsuitable backgrounds. They invited people to the wedding who they knew would make me uncomfortable: old girlfriends of David's from appropriate families and business associates who had already heard carefully crafted stories about their son's unfortunate choice in brides. But they also underestimated me in ways that would prove to be their downfall. They saw a girl from a trailer park who had gotten lucky, someone who could be intimidated or bought off, or simply worn down by sustained social pressure. They didn't see the lieutenant who had earned her rank through merit, who had faced down enemy fire and political minefields with equal determination. They didn't understand that every insult they delivered only strengthened my resolve. Every attempt to diminish me only reminded me of how far I had come and how much I had overcome. The morning of our wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect weather that makes photographers weep with joy and brides feel like the universe is blessing their union. I woke in the bridal suite of the Four Seasons, surrounded by my bridesmaids and the familiar chaos of wedding day preparations. My mother had flown in from Georgia, looking nervous but proud in the dress we had picked out together during one of her visits to Atlanta. She had never seen anything like the luxury surrounding us, but she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had raised a daughter strong enough to earn her place anywhere. As my makeup artist worked and my hairstylist fussed with the veil that had belonged to David's grandmother, I felt a peace settle over me that had nothing to do with the champagne my bridesmaids kept pressing into my hands. This day wasn't about proving anything to the Hartwell family or winning their acceptance. It was about claiming my place in David's life and creating a family of our own, one built on love and respect rather than tradition and obligation. Whatever happened at the reception, whatever new insults or challenges awaited me, I would face them as David's wife and as the woman I had worked so hard to become. The ceremony itself was everything we had dreamed of and more. David's eyes filled with tears when he saw me walking down the aisle, and for those precious minutes nothing existed except the promises we made to each other, and the future we were choosing to build together. My mother cried openly from the front row, her hand pressed to her heart as she watched her daughter marry into a world she had never imagined possible. Even Richard and Patricia seemed moved by the moment, their usual stern expressions softening as they watched their son pledge his life to mine. But the reception was where the real test would come, where champagne would loosen tongues and long-held resentments would finally find their voice. As we made our way into the ballroom for our first dance, I caught sight of Richard at the bar, already working on his third scotch of the evening. Patricia was holding court near the wedding cake, surrounded by her society friends and gesturing in my direction with barely concealed disdain. And Jessica was whispering something to her boyfriend that made him laugh loud enough to turn heads across the room. I should have known that they wouldn't be content to simply endure the evening in polite silence. I should have anticipated that they would find a way to remind everyone present exactly what they thought of their son's choice in brides. But I was still naive enough to hope that my wedding day might be sacred enough to warrant a temporary truce, that even the Hartwell family wouldn't stoop to public humiliation at such a moment. I was wrong. The toast began innocently enough, with Richard calling for attention from the assembled guests and raising his champagne glass in what appeared to be a gesture of familial celebration. David and I stood together near the head table, my hand in his, both of us smiling as we prepared to receive what we assumed would be the traditional blessing from the father of the groom. The ballroom quieted as conversations stopped and faces turned toward Richard, everyone expecting the kind of heartfelt speech that marked the joining of two families and the beginning of a new chapter. Instead, we got a masterclass in psychological warfare, delivered with the precision of a surgical strike. Richard Hartwell stood there in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his silver hair gleaming under the crystal chandeliers, and delivered the most devastating insult of my life, wrapped in the language of polite society. His words hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the ballroom and settling into the consciousness of every guest who had come to celebrate our union. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers as he finished speaking, crystal shattering against the marble floor like the last remnants of any hope I might have harbored for acceptance or reconciliation. But Richard Hartwell had made one crucial miscalculation in his moment of triumph. He had forgotten that the woman he was trying to humiliate wasn't the frightened girl from Pine Ridge anymore. She was Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a combat veteran who had earned her rank through courage and competence, who had led soldiers in battle and commanded respect in the most challenging environments imaginable. And she was about to remind everyone in that ballroom exactly what they were dealing with. The silence that followed his toast seemed to stretch for eternity, broken only by the soft tinkling of glass shards settling on the floor and the collective intake of breath from 200 horrified guests. I felt David's hand tighten around mine, felt the weight of every eye in the room focusing on my reaction, felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in my chest like acid. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment when the pretender would finally be exposed and put back in her proper place. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't the polite smile I had been practicing for months, the careful expression designed to win over skeptical in-laws and social climbers. It was the smile I had worn when enemy mortars were falling around our forward operating base and I needed to keep my team calm and focused. It was the smile that said I had been in worse situations than this and had come out stronger. It was the smile of a woman who had stopped caring what other people thought and had started caring about what she knew to be true. I released David's hand and stepped forward, my heels clicking against the marble floor as I moved toward the microphone that Richard had abandoned. Every step felt deliberate and measured, like the approach to an enemy position that required precision and confidence. The guests parted before me, some looking away in embarrassment, others leaning forward with curiosity, all of them sensing that something significant was about to happen. When I reached the microphone, I adjusted it to my height and looked out over the assembled crowd, taking in the sea of faces that represented the best of Atlanta society. These were the people who had built their lives on inherited wealth and social connections, who measured worth by bloodlines and bank accounts, who had never questioned their right to judge others based on circumstances of birth, rather than achievements earned through effort and sacrifice. They were about to learn something about respect that money couldn't buy, and breeding couldn't teach. My voice, when I finally spoke, was steady and clear, carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat and the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. The words that came out of my mouth would echo through Atlanta society for years to come, repeated at dinner parties and country club luncheons, as the story of the night a soldier reminded the city's elite exactly what courage looked like. And as I stood there in my wedding dress, surrounded by the scattered remains of Richard Hartwell's champagne glass and the stunned silence of his carefully curated guest list, I finally understood something that had taken me 28 years to learn. The approval of people who couldn't see my worth was itself worthless. The acceptance of those who required me to diminish myself wasn't acceptance at all. And the respect of people who had never earned anything through their own efforts wasn't respect worth having. This was my moment. My wedding, my husband, my life, my choice. And Richard Hartwell was about to discover that the girl from the trailer park had grown into a woman who didn't back down from anyone or anything. The words that followed would change everything. The microphone felt surprisingly light in my hands as I adjusted it, a stark contrast to the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. 200 faces stared back at me, some curious, others horrified, all waiting to see how the trailer park girl would respond to being publicly humiliated by one of Atlanta's most prominent families. The silence stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the soft rustle of expensive fabric as guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and the distant sound of ice settling in champagne buckets. I had rehearsed a speech for this moment, something gracious and heartfelt about joining the Hartwell family and building a future together. Those carefully chosen words seemed laughably inadequate now, dissolved by the acid of Richard's contempt, and the crystal-clear understanding that this had never been about acceptance or reconciliation. This had been about putting me in my place, reminding everyone present that some barriers couldn't be crossed, no matter how far you climbed or how hard you fought. But, standing there in my ivory gown, surrounded by the shattered remains of his champagne glass and the expectant silence of Atlanta's elite, I felt something shift inside me that had been building since the day I first walked into their marble foyer. The girl who had spent years trying to prove herself worthy of their approval was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that their approval had never been worth earning in the first place. My voice, when I finally spoke, carried across the ballroom with the clarity and authority of someone who had commanded troops under fire and briefed generals on battlefield intelligence. Every word was measured and deliberate, chosen for maximum impact and delivered with the precision of a surgical strike. Thank you, Richard, for that illuminating toast. I began, my tone conversational but carrying an edge that made several guests lean forward in their chairs. It's fascinating to finally hear what you really think, delivered with all the class and dignity I've come to expect from this family. A ripple of shocked murmurs ran through the crowd. Patricia's face had gone chalk white, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping her pearl necklace like a lifeline. Jessica was staring at me with a mixture of horror and fascination, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. And David stood behind me, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, as he watched his new wife declare war on everything his family represented. You see, ladies and gentlemen, I continued, turning to address the wider audience, I've spent the last year trying to understand what it means to be worthy of joining this family. I studied your social customs, learned your unspoken rules, attended your charity galas and country club dinners. I thought if I could just prove myself cultured enough, refined enough, acceptable enough, then maybe I could earn my place at your table. The ballroom had become so quiet that the sound of my heels clicking against the marble floor seemed to echo like gunshots as I moved away from the microphone stand, my train rustling behind me like the whisper of justice delayed but not denied. But tonight, Richard has finally given me the gift of clarity. He's shown me that this was never about earning acceptance. This was always about putting me in my place, reminding me that some people are born to matter and others are born to serve. That some families deserve respect based on their bloodlines, while others must constantly justify their right to exist in the same space. I paused, letting my words sink in as I surveyed the faces before me. Some guests were nodding slowly, recognition dawning in their eyes. Others looked away, uncomfortable with having their own prejudices held up to the light. And a few, the ones who had grown up with money and privilege as their birthright, stared at me with the kind of outrage reserved for servants who forgot their place. Richard called me damaged goods from the trailer park, I said, my voice rising slightly but remaining perfectly controlled. And you know what? He's absolutely right about where I come from. I did grow up in a trailer park. My mother did work double shifts at a textile factory to keep food on our table. I did wear secondhand clothes and carry my lunch in brown paper bags while your children carried designer lunch boxes and wore shoes that cost more than my mother's weekly paycheck. The admission sent another wave of whispers through the crowd, but I pressed on, my voice gaining strength with each word. But what Richard fails to understand, what all of you fail to understand, is that those experiences didn't damage me, they forged me. They taught me the value of hard work and the meaning of sacrifice. They showed me that respect is earned through character and courage, not inherited through trust funds and family names. I turned back toward Richard, who was standing frozen beside the head table, his face a mottled red that clashed horribly with his pristine tuxedo. You want to talk about breeding, Richard? Let's talk about what really matters. Let's talk about the breeding that produces men who send other people's children to war while keeping their own safely tucked away in Ivy League universities. Let's talk about the breeding that builds wealth on the backs of workers who will never see the inside of a country club. Let's talk about the breeding that teaches people to measure worth by bank accounts instead of blood spilled in service to something greater than themselves. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the implications of my words sank in. Several of the older men in the audience shifted uncomfortably, their own military deferments and family connections suddenly feeling less like privileges and more like sources of shame. Their wives clutched their jewelry with white-knuckled fingers, as if physical displays of wealth could somehow shield them from the uncomfortable truths being spoken. I spent 3 tours in Afghanistan, I continued, my voice now carrying the full weight of my military bearing. I led teams of soldiers who trusted me with their lives and their missions. I coordinated intelligence operations that saved American lives and disrupted enemy networks. I earned my rank through merit, my respect through competence, and my authority through results. I gestured toward the assembled crowd, taking in the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns that represented millions of dollars in inherited wealth and social positioning. How many of you can say the same? How many of you have ever been tested by anything more challenging than choosing between the Martha's Vineyard house and the Aspen chalet for your summer vacation? How many of you have ever had to prove your worth through anything more demanding than writing a check to the right charity or attending the right fundraiser? The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the wheels turning in dozens of minds. The uncomfortable recognition that their comfortable lives had been built on foundations they had never examined or questioned. These were people who had inherited their positions in society, who had never faced real adversity, or been forced to prove themselves through anything more challenging than maintaining family connections and social appearances. But here's what's really amusing about your little toast, Richard, I said, turning back to my father-in-law with a smile that could have cut glass. You seem to think that calling me damaged goods is some kind of devastating insult. You seem to believe that reminding everyone of my humble origins will somehow diminish me in their eyes, or convince your son that he's made a terrible mistake. I paused, letting the suspense build as every person in the ballroom held their breath, waiting to see where this was leading. What you don't understand is that I'm proud of where I come from. I'm proud of the woman who raised me, who worked herself to exhaustion to give me opportunities she never had. I'm proud of the trailer park neighbors who taught me that family isn't about blood or money, but about people who show up for each other when times get hard. I'm proud of every callus on my mother's hands and every sacrifice she made to help me reach this moment. My voice broke slightly as I thought about Linda Cooper, sitting somewhere in this crowd of strangers, watching her daughter defend not just herself but the entire world they had come from. She had never asked for wealth or status or social acceptance. She had only wanted her daughter to have choices she had never been given, opportunities she had never imagined possible. And I'm proud of the soldiers I served with, I continued, my voice growing stronger again. Men and women who came from small towns and inner cities, from farm families and immigrant communities, who put on the uniform and served their country without asking what was in it for them. They're the real aristocracy of America, the people who prove their worth through service and sacrifice instead of trust fund statements and country club memberships. I could see David in my peripheral vision, his face a mixture of pride and panic, as he watched his wife systematically dismantle everything his family represented. Part of me felt sorry for him, caught between the woman he loved and the family that had shaped his entire identity. But another part of me knew that this moment had been inevitable from the day we met, that our love could only survive if he was willing to choose the future we could build together over the past that had been handed to him. "So yes, Richard, I am damaged goods from the trailer park," I said, my voice now ringing with absolute conviction. "I'm damaged by the knowledge that respect must be earned rather than inherited. I'm damaged by the understanding that character matters more than pedigree. I'm damaged by the experience of leading people who judged me by my actions rather than my address." The ballroom had become so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from Peachtree Street. Every eye was fixed on me, every ear straining to catch my words, every mind grappling with concepts that challenged the fundamental assumptions that had governed their entire lives. "And if that kind of damage makes me unsuitable for your family," I continued, my smile growing wider and more dangerous, "then I consider that the highest compliment you could possibly pay me." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then, slowly, from somewhere in the middle of the ballroom, came the sound of applause. It started with just one person, then another, until nearly half the room was clapping. These weren't the country club crowd or the old Atlanta families. These were the younger guests, the friends David and I had made during our engagement, the military personnel who had come to support me, the few family members who had traveled from Georgia to witness my wedding. But it was enough. It was enough to show Richard and Patricia and their entire social circle that their opinions weren't universal, that their values weren't shared by everyone, that their power to humiliate and exclude had limits they had never recognized before. As the applause died down, I turned back to the microphone for my final words. "This is supposed to be a celebration of love," I said, my voice now gentle but still carrying the authority I had earned through years of leadership and command. "A celebration of two people choosing to build a life together based on mutual respect and shared values. David and I didn't choose each other because of our family backgrounds or our social connections. We chose each other because we saw something valuable and worthy of love in each other's character." I looked directly at David, who was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't fear or embarrassment or concern about what his family might think. It was pure, undiluted admiration for the woman he had married, recognition that he had chosen someone stronger and braver than he had ever imagined possible. "So for those of you who came here to celebrate with us, to support our marriage, and wish us well in our future together, thank you. Your presence here means more to us than you could possibly know." I paused, my gaze sweeping across the crowd one final time before settling on Richard's furious face. "And for those of you who came here to judge me, to measure my worth by standards I'll never meet and don't want to meet, I have only one thing to say. The girl from the trailer park isn't going anywhere. She's Mrs. David Hartwell now, and she's going to spend the rest of her life proving that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose for ourselves, rather than the ones we're born into." I set the microphone back in its stand and stepped away, my train rustling behind me as I moved toward David. The ballroom erupted in chaos, with some guests applauding enthusiastically while others sat in stunned silence or whispered frantically to their neighbors. I could see Patricia dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though whether from tears of rage or humiliation was impossible to tell. Jessica was staring at me with naked hatred, her beautiful face twisted into an expression of pure malice. And Richard stood frozen beside the remnants of his shattered champagne glass, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the look in David's eyes as I reached him, the way his hands trembled as he reached out to take mine, the pride and love and absolute certainty that radiated from his entire being. "I love you," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the din of the crowd. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "I love you too," I whispered back, standing on my tiptoes to brush my lips against his ear. "But are you ready for what comes next? Because I don't think your family is going to forgive this anytime soon." David's laugh was shaky but genuine, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and something that looked remarkably like relief. "I've been waiting my whole life for someone brave enough to say what you just said. If they can't handle having a real woman in the family instead of another decorative accessory, then that's their loss." The band, sensing that the evening's entertainment had taken an unexpected turn, began playing again, filling the awkward silence with the gentle strains of jazz standards that seemed almost surreal after the confrontation that had just unfolded. Some guests began moving toward the bar, others gathered in small groups to dissect what they had just witnessed, and a few hearty souls actually approached us to offer their congratulations and support. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had taught Sunday school at David's church for 40 years, was among the first to reach us. Her eyes were bright with approval as she clasped my hands in her papery ones. "My dear," she said in a voice that carried the authority of decades spent managing unruly children and stubborn adults, "that was the finest speech I've heard in 50 years of Atlanta society gatherings. It's about time someone reminded these people what really matters in life." Behind her came Colonel Martinez, a friend from my military days who had driven down from Fort Gordon for the wedding. His salute was crisp and precise, his smile broader than I had ever seen it. "Outstanding performance, Lieutenant," he said formally, then dropped his voice to add, "though I think you might have just ended the career of anyone in this room who's ever applied for a military contract." The thought hadn't occurred to me, but as I looked around the ballroom at the sea of uncomfortable faces, I realized that Colonel Martinez might be right. Richard's real estate empire had been built partly on government contracts and military housing projects. Patricia's charity work focused heavily on military families and veterans organizations. Their social standing in Atlanta was built on a carefully constructed image of patriotic support for the armed forces, even as they privately disdained the very people who actually served. "Good," I said simply, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "Maybe it's time they learned that you can't profit from supporting the military while looking down on the people who actually wear the uniform." The evening continued in surreal fashion, with the wedding reception transforming into something unprecedented in Atlanta society history. The crowd gradually separated into distinct camps: those who supported my speech and wanted to congratulate us, those who were horrified by the breach of social protocol and huddled together in scandalized whispers, and those who seemed genuinely uncertain about how to process what they had witnessed. David and I moved through the ballroom like diplomats navigating a complex international incident, accepting congratulations from some guests while carefully avoiding others. The photographer, a consummate professional who had probably witnessed his share of family drama over the years, continued taking pictures with the dedication of a war correspondent documenting history in the making. My mother appeared at my elbow sometime during the chaos, her face glowing with pride and fierce maternal satisfaction. She had spent years watching her daughter shrink herself to fit into spaces where she wasn't wanted, and seeing me finally claim my full power and dignity seemed to vindicate every sacrifice she had ever made. "I am so proud of you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father would have been proud too. He always said you had fight in you that would show itself when it mattered most." The mention of my father, who had died when I was 12, and whose absence had shaped so much of my determination to succeed, brought tears to my eyes for the first time that evening. He had been a mechanic and a veteran himself, a quiet man who had taught me that real strength came from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and standing up to bullies regardless of their size or status. "He would have loved seeing you put that pompous ass in his place," my mother continued, glancing toward Richard, who was still standing beside the head table looking like a man who had just watched his entire worldview collapse. "He always said that people who look down on working folks have forgotten that they'd starve without us." As the evening wore on, the full implications of what had happened began to crystallize. This wasn't just a family argument or a moment of wedding drama that would be forgotten by next week. This was a fundamental challenge to the social order that governed Atlanta's elite circles, delivered by someone who couldn't be dismissed or marginalized in the usual ways. I was a decorated military officer with an impeccable service record and a compelling personal story. I was married to one of their own, someone whose family connections ran deep into the heart of Atlanta society. And I had just demonstrated that I was willing to fight for my dignity and my principles, regardless of the social or financial consequences. The older generation of Atlanta society matrons huddled together near the bar, their voices rising and falling in agitated whispers as they tried to process the unprecedented breach of social protocol they had just witnessed. Their daughters and daughters-in-law, many of whom had sat through similar humiliations over the years, watched with expressions ranging from horror to secret admiration. The men were divided along different lines. The older generation, Richard's contemporaries who had built their wealth through similar combinations of inherited privilege and ruthless social climbing, clearly saw me as a threat to the natural order of things. But their sons and younger business associates seemed more intrigued than offended, perhaps recognizing that the world was changing in ways that made my speech less scandalous and more inevitable. The military personnel in attendance formed their own informal receiving line, offering congratulations and sharing stories about similar confrontations they had witnessed or participated in over the years. These were people who understood that respect was earned rather than inherited, that leadership came from character rather than connections, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought in ballrooms rather than battlefields. As midnight approached, the crowd began to thin. The older generation departed in carefully orchestrated groups, their expressions grim, and their whispered conversations clearly focused on damage control and strategic planning. The younger crowd lingered longer, some approaching us with genuine admiration for what I had done, others simply curious about what might happen next. Richard and Patricia made their exit without speaking to us again, their faces masks of barely controlled fury and wounded dignity. Jessica followed close behind, pausing only long enough to deliver a look of pure venom that promised future retaliation. The rest of David's extended family departed in similar fashion, creating a receiving line of cold shoulders and pointed snubs that would have devastated me a year earlier but now seemed almost comically petty. David watched his family's departure with an expression of profound sadness mixed with unmistakable relief. These were people who had shaped his entire life, who had provided him with education and opportunities and social connections that had defined his identity since birth. But they were also people who had never seen him as anything more than an extension of their own ambitions, who had never valued his happiness or his choices when they conflicted with their own agenda. "Are you okay?" I asked him as we watched the last of his relatives disappear into the Atlanta night. "I think so," he said slowly, his voice thoughtful rather than devastated. "I keep waiting to feel guilty or regretful, but mostly, I just feel free. Like, I've been holding my breath for 30 years and can finally exhale." The cleanup crew began moving through the ballroom, collecting champagne glasses and removing floral arrangements with the efficient discretion of people who had seen their share of eventful evenings. The shattered remains of Richard's champagne glass had been swept up hours earlier, but the memory of that crystalline crash would echo through Atlanta society for years to come. As David and I finally prepared to leave for our honeymoon suite, Colonel Martinez approached one final time. His expression was serious, almost concerned, as he pulled me aside for a private word. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what you did tonight was necessary and right. But you need to understand that you've just declared war on some very powerful people. Richard Hartwell has connections throughout Georgia politics and business. His wife chairs committees that control millions in charitable donations. They have the resources and the motivation to make your life very difficult." I considered his warning carefully, understanding the implications of what he was saying. The Hartwell family wasn't just wealthy and well-connected. They were part of the machinery that ran Georgia society, with tentacles reaching into everything, from university admissions to political appointments to business contracts. Crossing them publicly wouldn't just affect my relationship with David's family. It could impact our careers, our social standing, and our future opportunities in ways I was only beginning to understand. "What are you suggesting I do?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "Nothing," he said with a slight smile. You did exactly what needed to be done. I just want you to be prepared for the counterattack, because it's coming. People like the Hartwells don't forgive public humiliation, and they have long memories and deep pockets. His words stayed with me as David and I finally left the ballroom, still in our wedding attire but feeling like completely different people than the naive couple who had exchanged vows earlier that day. The girl who had spent months trying to win over Richard and Patricia Hartwell was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the cost. The honeymoon suite was a sanctuary of quiet luxury after the chaos of the reception, with rose petals scattered across Egyptian cotton sheets and champagne chilling in a silver bucket that caught the city lights streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Atlanta sprawled below us like a glittering web of possibilities and threats, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. As I stood at the window, still in my wedding gown but with my hair loose around my shoulders and my shoes kicked off somewhere near the door, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The lonely nights in my childhood bedroom, listening to my mother count tip money at the kitchen table. The first day of basic training, when I realized that the Army would judge me by standards I could actually meet. The moment I met David and allowed myself to believe that love might be possible after all. And now this. My wedding night, in a city that would never look at me the same way again. Married to a man who had chosen me over everything he had been taught to value. Surrounded by the consequences of decisions that couldn't be undone or taken back. Any regrets? David asked from behind me, his voice soft but carrying an undercurrent of genuine concern. I turned to face him, taking in the sight of my husband loosening his bow tie with hands that still trembled slightly from the evening's adrenaline. He looked older somehow, as if the events of the night had forced him to grow up in ways that 30 years of privilege had never required. None, I said simply, and meant it completely. What about you? His smile was answer enough, but he spoke anyway, his words carrying the weight of choices that would define the rest of our lives. I married the strongest woman I've ever met, he said, crossing the room to take my hands in his. Someone who's brave enough to fight for what's right, even when it costs her everything. How could I regret that? Outside our window, Atlanta slept fitfully, unaware that the social order that had governed its elite circles for generations had been challenged by a girl from a trailer park who had grown into a woman strong enough to demand the respect she had always deserved. The consequences of that challenge would ripple through the city's power structures for years to come, but that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight, we were just two people who had chosen love over expectation, courage over comfort, truth over tradition. And in a world that too often rewarded inherited privilege over earned merit, that felt like the most radical act of all. The morning after our wedding dawned gray and overcast, with heavy clouds hanging low over Atlanta like a physical manifestation of the storm I had unleashed the night before. David and I had planned to spend our first day as a married couple exploring the city before flying to Costa Rica for our honeymoon. But the phone started ringing at 6 a.m. and didn't stop for 3 hours. The first call was from David's law firm. The managing partner, a man named Charles Whitman, who had been a family friend for decades, wanted to schedule an emergency meeting to discuss the potential impact of last night's events on David's career prospects. The second call was from Patricia's sister, demanding that David choose between his wife and his family before irreparable damage was done to their reputation. The third call was from a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who had somehow gotten wind of the story and wanted a comment about the society wedding that had turned into a public spectacle. By the time the phone finally stopped ringing, we both understood that our lives had fundamentally changed overnight. The comfortable anonymity we had enjoyed during our engagement was gone, replaced by the kind of public attention that follows controversy like smoke follows fire. Atlanta society might have been shocked by my speech, but they were also fascinated by it, and fascination has a way of spreading beyond the insular world of country clubs and charity galas. David sat on the edge of our hotel bed, still in his pajamas, scrolling through social media on his phone with an expression of growing amazement. Video clips of my speech had been posted by multiple wedding guests, and they were spreading across Facebook and Twitter, with the viral intensity usually reserved for celebrity scandals or political gaffes. The comments ranged from enthusiastic support to outraged condemnation, but they all shared one common element. Everyone had an opinion about what had happened. "Look at this," David said, showing me his phone screen. "Your speech has been shared over 10,000 times in the last 12 hours. There are news articles being written about it. Someone started a hashtag called Trailer Park Princess that's trending in Atlanta." The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard Hartwell had intended to humiliate me by reminding everyone of my humble origins. But instead, he had created a symbol that people were rallying around. Women were sharing their own stories about overcoming class discrimination and family prejudice. Veterans were posting about the disconnect between public support for the military and private disdain for service members who didn't fit certain social expectations. Young professionals from working-class backgrounds were expressing gratitude for someone finally saying what they had been thinking for years. But not all the attention was positive. Patricia had mobilized her extensive network of society matrons, and they were conducting their own campaign to frame my speech as an ungrateful attack on a family that had welcomed me with open arms. Anonymous sources were feeding stories to gossip columnists about my inappropriate behavior and David's poor judgment. The country club where Richard held membership was reportedly considering whether to revoke privileges for members who brought disrepute to the institution. The most disturbing development came in a call from my commanding officer at Fort Gordon. Colonel Harrison's voice was carefully neutral as he informed me that questions had been raised about my conduct at a civilian social function and whether it reflected poorly on military professionalism. An informal inquiry would be conducted to determine if any disciplinary action was warranted. The implication was clear. Richard Hartwell's connections extended into military contracting and defense industry relationships that could influence my career in ways I hadn't anticipated. Someone with access to the right ears had suggested that a serving officer who caused public controversy might not be the kind of person the Army wanted representing its values and interests. "They can't punish you for defending yourself," David said when I explained the situation. "What you said last night was completely justified." "The military doesn't always care about justification," I replied, understanding the political dynamics at play better than my civilian husband could. "They care about maintaining relationships with people who have influence over budgets and contracts. If keeping Richard Hartwell happy means sacrificing one lieutenant who caused him embarrassment, that's a trade they might be willing to make." The realization that my military career could be threatened by my speech added a new dimension to the consequences I was facing. The Army had been my refuge, my identity, my path to self-respect and financial security. Losing it would mean starting over again, rebuilding my life from scratch, while carrying the stigma of someone who had been forced out of service for conduct issues. But even as I contemplated these possibilities, I found that I couldn't bring myself to regret what I had done. The girl from Pine Ridge had spent too many years swallowing insults and accepting second-class treatment to start apologizing now. If defending my dignity and my mother's honor cost me my career, then at least I would know that I had stood up for something that mattered. Our honeymoon became an exercise in damage control, disguised as a romantic getaway. Even in the lush rainforests of Costa Rica, surrounded by exotic birds and cascading waterfalls, we couldn't escape the digital tentacles of the controversy we had left behind. David's phone buzzed constantly, with updates from his law firm, his family, and the various crisis management consultants who had been enlisted to help repair his reputation. The most absurd development came when we discovered that someone had created a Wikipedia page about me, complete with details about my military service, my childhood in Pine Ridge, and my infamous wedding speech that challenged Atlanta's social hierarchy. The page had been edited dozens of times by anonymous contributors, with some adding supportive information about my combat deployments, while others attempted to discredit my service record or spread unflattering rumors about my personal life. "This is insane," David muttered, reading through the latest batch of messages from his family's public relations team. "They want us to issue a joint statement apologizing for any offense caused and expressing our commitment to Atlanta's values and traditions. They've even written a draft that makes it sound like you were overcome by wedding day emotions and said things you didn't really mean." The suggested statement was a masterpiece of political doublespeak, acknowledging that feelings had been hurt while carefully avoiding any admission that Richard's behavior had been inappropriate. It portrayed me as a young woman who had gotten carried away in a moment of high emotion, rather than a combat veteran who had made a deliberate choice to confront prejudice and discrimination. "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "I meant every word I said, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make his family feel better about their own behavior." "I didn't think you would," David replied with a smile that mixed pride with apprehension. "But I needed to ask, because they're making it clear that my career at the firm depends on how we handle this situation. Charles Whitman has been getting pressure from clients who move in the same social circles as my parents. They want assurance that I can be trusted to represent their interests without causing further embarrassment." The pressure David was facing at work was just one aspect of the broader campaign being waged against us. Patricia had enlisted her charity board connections to subtly undermine my reputation in military support organizations, spreading whispers about my, quote, inappropriate behavior and lack of gratitude for family acceptance. Richard had reached out to business contacts who might have influence over defense contractors, suggesting that supporting officers who cause social disruption might not be in their best interests. Even my mother back in Georgia was feeling the backlash. Anonymous calls to her apartment building had prompted her landlord to ask uncomfortable questions about her daughter's recent notoriety. The textile factory where she worked had received complaints from customers who objected to employing the mother of someone who had caused such a public spectacle. "They're trying to make everyone connected to me pay a price for what I did," I told David as we sat on the balcony of our Costa Rican hotel, watching howler monkeys swing through the canopy below. "This isn't just about punishing me anymore. They want to send a message to anyone else who might be thinking about challenging their authority." "Then we fight back," David said, his voice carrying a determination I had rarely heard from him before. "We don't let them win by intimidating everyone around us." But fighting back required resources and connections that we were only beginning to understand. The Hartwell family had spent generations building relationships and accumulating favors that could be called in during times of crisis. They had lawyers and publicists and social connections that extended far beyond Atlanta's city limits. Most importantly, they had the kind of old money that allowed them to wage sustained campaigns without worrying about the financial cost. What they hadn't counted on was the power of my story to resonate with people far beyond their immediate social circle. The video of my speech continued to spread across social media platforms, picked up by military support groups, women's organizations, and working-class advocacy networks that had their own platforms and influence. Comment sections filled with similar stories from people who had faced class discrimination in corporate settings, academic institutions, and social organizations. A particularly powerful response came from Senator Maria Gonzalez, a rising star in Georgia politics who had grown up in similar circumstances to mine. She issued a statement praising my courage and calling for a broader conversation about class prejudice in American society. Her endorsement brought national attention to the story, with cable news programs beginning to cover it as an example of ongoing tensions between America's democratic ideals and its persistent class divisions. The growing media attention forced the Hartwell family to recalibrate their strategy. What had started as a private campaign to punish an ungrateful daughter-in-law was becoming a public relations nightmare that threatened to damage their own reputation. Richard's real estate company began receiving negative reviews on social media platforms from veterans and military families who objected to his treatment of a service member. Patricia's charity work came under scrutiny from donors who questioned whether someone with such obvious class prejudices should be trusted to fairly distribute resources to military families. The turning point came when a local television news program decided to do an investigative piece about military families and social acceptance in Atlanta. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica Chen, had done her homework thoroughly. She interviewed my former commanding officers, who spoke glowingly about my leadership abilities and service record. She talked to families in military housing, who shared their own experiences with social discrimination. And she conducted a devastating interview with Richard himself, who attempted to defend his wedding toast by explaining that he had simply been expressing concerns about family compatibility. The interview made Richard look petty and prejudiced, particularly when he tried to suggest that military service, while admirable, didn't necessarily prepare someone for the responsibilities of joining a prominent family. His comments about the importance of proper breeding and social preparation came across as elitist and out of touch, especially when contrasted with footage of my military awards ceremony and testimonials from soldiers who had served under my command. The broadcast aired during our final week in Costa Rica, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. David's law firm, suddenly concerned about their association with someone who had been publicly exposed as prejudiced against military families, began distancing themselves from the Hartwell family pressure campaign. Several of Richard's business partners issued statements expressing their personal support for military families and their disagreement with any sentiments that might suggest otherwise. More importantly, the military inquiry into my conduct was quietly dropped after Colonel Harrison received calls from several congressional offices asking pointed questions about whether the Army was allowing civilian political pressure to influence personnel decisions. The optics of punishing a decorated combat veteran for defending herself against public humiliation were too problematic for an institution that depended on public support and political goodwill. "It's over," David said as we packed our bags for the flight home to Atlanta. "They overplayed their hand. The story got too big for them to control, and now they're the ones dealing with public relations problems instead of us." But I knew it wasn't really over. Public attention would eventually move on to other stories, and when it did, the Hartwell family would still be there, still wealthy and connected, still capable of making our lives difficult in subtle ways that wouldn't attract media scrutiny. The difference was that I no longer cared about their approval or their acceptance. I had learned something valuable during our honeymoon from hell. My worth wasn't dependent on their recognition, and my future wasn't contingent on their permission. The woman who had grown up in a trailer park and earned her place through service and sacrifice didn't need validation from people who had inherited their status and never been tested by real adversity. What I needed was to continue building a life based on the values I had learned from my mother and my military service: hard work, integrity, courage, and the understanding that respect is earned rather than granted. When we returned to Atlanta, it was to a changed landscape. The society pages that had once seemed so important now felt irrelevant and small. The country club invitations that had been so carefully sought during our engagement were no longer extended. But we discovered that we didn't miss them. Instead, we found ourselves part of a different community. Military families, young professionals from diverse backgrounds, and people who valued character over connections. David's career took an unexpected turn when he was recruited by a firm that specialized in representing veterans and military families in legal matters. His experience with class discrimination and his wife's military background made him an ideal advocate for clients who had faced similar challenges. The work was more meaningful than corporate law had ever been, and the respect he earned was based on results rather than family connections. My own career flourished as well, with the national attention leading to opportunities for speaking engagements and consulting work, with organizations focused on military transition and class mobility. The story that Richard Hartwell had intended to use as a weapon against me became a platform for discussing issues that mattered to millions of Americans who had faced similar struggles. Years later, when people ask me about that night at the Four Seasons Ballroom, I tell them that it was the moment I stopped trying to be acceptable to people whose acceptance wasn't worth having. It was the night I learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or strategies, but with words that carry the weight of truth and the power of someone who refuses to be diminished by others' prejudices. The girl from Pine Ridge had finally come home to herself, and she was stronger than anyone had ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.